A disgraced railroad engineer, haunted by his past, must save a proud Comanche woman from the very tracks he designed, forging an unlikely alliance to take down a ruthless tycoon in a battle of horses, steam, and steel. The sun, a merciless fist, hammered down on the New Mexico plains, baking the earth into a cracked, unforgiving canvas. But even that brutal heat couldn't drown out the sound, a low, mournful moan at first, growing into a guttural roar that vibrated through the very bones of the land. Ethan Miller, dust-caked and weary, squinted against the glare, his hand instinctively going to the worn leather of his saddle. He'd heard that sound countless times, knew it meant the iron serpent was on its way. What he didn't expect to see, sprawled across the glinting steel rails, was a figure, a woman, bound. His heart seized. It wasn't a trick of the light, no mirage born of thirst and solitude. This was real. A knot of terror tightened in his gut, a cold dread he hadn't felt since the Silver Creek disaster. He spurred his horse. Dusty, a raw-boned Mustang with more grit than grace, into a desperate gallop. The train whistle shrieked again, closer now, a banshee's cry echoing through the narrow canyon pass. "Hold on!" he yelled, though he knew she couldn't hear him over the approaching thunder. He flung himself from Dusty's back, hitting the ground in a rolling tangle of limbs and leather. The woman, dark hair splayed across the ties, eyes wide with a defiant, yet desperate, terror, struggled against the ropes that bit into her wrists and ankles. Comanche, he realized. Her buckskin leggings, her intricate beadwork. No mistaking it. The train was a black behemoth now, smoke belching from its stack, growing larger, faster, every terrifying second. He could see the engineer, a dim silhouette, leaning out, likely oblivious. Or worse, uncaring. Ethan cursed, pulling his Bowie knife from its sheath. His hands, usually so steady with a drafting pen, trembled as he knelt beside her, the vibration of the track a living thing beneath him. "Stay still," he gritted out, his voice a strained whisper against the escalating roar. He saw the fire in her eyes, even amidst her fear. She glared at him, suspicion warring with sheer animal instinct. She didn't trust him, and why should she? He was a white man, a ghost of the very force that had put her here. But there was no time for explanations, no room for old grievances. He sliced at the thick, unforgiving rope around her ankles, the dull steel grating against the sisal fibers. 1, 2, 3 cuts. The rope frayed, then snapped. He moved to her wrists, his fingers fumbling with urgency. The engine was so close now, its monstrous headlight blinding, its steam hissing like 1,000 angry vipers. The very air around them thrummed with its power. He could feel the ground trembling, taste the acrid smoke already. "Almost," he gasped, gritting his teeth. The last strand gave way. He grabbed her arm, pulling with all his might. She was lighter than he expected, but her surprise and weakened state made her an uncooperative weight. He hauled her off the tracks, tumbling them both down the shallow embankment, just as the lead cowcatcher, a massive iron shovel, sliced through the space where her head had rested moments before. The train roared past, a thunderous blur of steel and steam, deafening them with its passage, whipping their clothes and hair with its violent wind. Each car clattered by, a mocking, endless procession, reminding them of the sheer force of the world that had almost claimed her. Then, as suddenly as it had arrived, it was gone, leaving only the distant, fading shriek of its whistle, and a ringing silence that felt even louder than the noise. Ethan lay there, gasping for breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked at the woman beside him, her chest heaving, her eyes still wide, scanned the tracks, then locked onto him. No gratitude, only raw, undiluted fury. She scrambled backward, pushing herself up on shaky limbs, her bare feet finding purchase on the rough ground, her hands, though still raw from the ropes, clenched into fists. "You," she hissed, the word a venomous whisper in broken English, pointing a trembling finger at him. "White man, you bring the iron serpent." He held up his hands, placating. I saved you. They left you for dead." He pointed back at the tracks, then down the way the train had gone. "Blackwood's men. They did this." Her gaze sharpened, though the anger didn't diminish. She looked from his eyes to his knife, then back to his worn, dusty clothes. He wasn't one of the slick, clean-cut railroad enforcers. He was a cowboy, albeit one who looked like he carried the weight of 1,000 sunsets on his shoulders. "Come on," he urged, pushing himself up slowly, his muscles screaming in protest. "We can't stay here. They might come back." She hesitated, her eyes flicking between him and the empty tracks. The instinct for self-preservation, honed by a lifetime on the frontier, outweighed her immediate distrust. She nodded curtly, then turned and began to walk, favoring her left ankle. Her defiance was palpable, even in retreat. Ethan whistled for Dusty, who trotted over, whinnying softly. He secured his horse, then followed Ayoka, keeping a respectful distance. He led her to a small hidden alcove he'd discovered years ago, a shallow overhang in the canyon wall, just big enough for a small fire and 2 people to shelter. The setting sun painted the sky in streaks of fiery orange and deep purple as they reached the camp. He rummaged in his saddlebag, pulling out a small canteen and a strip of dried jerky. "Here," he offered, pushing them towards her. She ignored the jerky, but snatched the canteen, drinking deeply, her throat working. As she lowered it, her eyes met his again, still wary, but a hint of exhaustion softened their edges. "My name is Ethan," he offered quietly, trying a few words in Comanche he remembered from old trading days. "Shie, friend." She looked away, then back, a ghost of a frown on her brow. "Ahyoka," she finally said, her voice rough but clear. "Why? Why what? Why you save me?" Her gaze was piercing, seeking something beyond the obvious. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "They left you to die. No man deserves that. No woman." He paused, then his eyes drifted to her arm. The rope burns were deep, angry red welts. As he knelt to examine them, gently, carefully, his gaze caught on something else, just above the worst of the abrasions, a small, faint mark on her forearm, a scar, shaped like a tiny, perfect star. His breath hitched. He froze, his fingers hovering over her skin. He felt a tremor go through her, a sudden stiffening. "What is it?" she demanded, pulling her arm back instinctively. He didn't answer right away. Instead, his hand went to his breast pocket, fumbling for the worn leather journal he always carried. He opened it, flipping through the crinkled pages, past sketches of steam engines and bridges, past observations of the landscape, until he found it. A faded charcoal sketch, rendered with a light, almost ethereal touch. A young girl, maybe 10 or 12, with fierce, intelligent eyes, her hair braided with feathers, and on her arm, unmistakable, the same star-shaped scar. He held it out to her, his hand trembling slightly. Ahyoka's eyes widened, her anger replaced by a profound bewilderment. She took the journal, her fingers tracing the faded lines of the drawing, then back to her own arm. "It was many years ago," Ethan said, his voice raspy with emotion. "I was with a survey crew. We traded near the Red River. Your father. He gave me water. You gave me this." He pointed to a small, intricately carved wooden bird tied to a leather thong around his neck. hidden beneath his shirt. A gift. For a broken arrow I fixed. Ahyoka stared at the drawing, then at him. The memory, faint and distant, flickered in her own mind. A young white man, not like the others, with kind eyes and a quiet way of moving. He'd helped mend a prized hunting arrow her brother had broken. She'd given him her small carving, a symbol of a warrior's spirit. The revelation hung in the air, a delicate, unexpected bridge between them. The random stranger who saved her was not so random after all. He was a ghost from a time of innocence, a memory she hadn't known she cherished. The fire of her immediate rage began to cool, replaced by a deep, confusing sense of connection. He watched her, hoping, waiting. "I was an engineer," he confessed, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "For the railroad, the same one that brought these tracks here, the same one Blackwood owns." His gaze dropped to the ground, heavy with unspoken guilt. "I left it all, tried to run from it. But it seems some tracks. They follow you." She looked from the sketch, to the tracks now fading into the twilight, then to his troubled eyes. The iron serpent had tried to kill her, and the man who had built it had just saved her. The world, she realized, was far more complicated than a simple line in the sand. The fire crackled, spitting embers into the vast, indifferent dark. It was the only warmth in a world that had suddenly grown cold and strange. Ahyoka held the leather-bound journal in her hands as if it were a sacred object, her thumb tracing the charcoal lines that captured a face she barely remembered, the face of a girl who had never seen an iron rail, who believed the world was as wide and free as the sky above. The silence between them stretched, thick with the weight of years and the impossible coincidence that had thrown them together. "I remember the day," she said finally, her voice low, almost a whisper. She did not look at him, but at the flickering flames. The men with the long eyes. She meant the surveyors' transits. They looked at the land, but they did not see it. They measured, but they did not feel its spirit. "I thought you were like them." Ethan shook his head, the movement slow and heavy. "I was worse. I was their leader." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small tin box. Inside was a salve that smelled sharply of pine and something medicinal, along with clean strips of linen. "Let me see to those burns. They'll fester if we don't clean them." She recoiled slightly when he moved closer, a reflexive tensing of her muscles. He stopped, holding the tin out as an offering. "Please," he said, his voice quiet. I'm not them. Not anymore." For a long moment, she weighed his words, her dark eyes searching his face for any hint of deception. She saw only a profound weariness, a sadness that seemed etched into the lines around his eyes. Slowly, reluctantly, she extended her arm. He knelt before her, dabbing the cool, soothing salve onto the raw, chafed skin of her wrists. His touch was surprisingly gentle, the movements precise and careful, the hands of a man used to delicate work. She flinched as the medicine stung, a sharp intake of breath through her teeth, but she did not pull away. "My hands were meant for drawing lines on paper," he said, his voice barely audible above the fire. "Drafting schematics for bridges, calculating the stress on steel. I believed in it. I truly did. I saw the beauty in the machine, in the idea of connecting one ocean to another, a great steel artery for a new nation." He shook his head, a bitter smile touching his lips. "I was a poet, and my ink was iron and steam." He finished with her wrists, wrapping them loosely in the clean linen, then moved to her ankles. She watched him, silent, seeing the conflict in him. The man who spoke of poetry and the man who had laid this path of destruction were one and the same. "The nation you speak of," she said, her voice hard as flint, "is a tide of hungry ghosts. It swallows everything. The buffalo, the rivers, the land of our ancestors. Your steel artery is a serpent, and it is poisoning the heart of the world." He didn't argue. He simply nodded, accepting the truth of her words as if they were his own long-held conviction. "It didn't take me long to see it," he admitted, tying off the last bandage. "The poetry was a lie. It was never about connecting a nation. It was about money. It was always about Bartholomew Blackwood's money." He sat back on his heels, the firelight casting his face in stark relief. "Blackwood doesn't see plains or mountains. He sees ore deposits. He doesn't see tribes. He sees obstacles on a map to be cleared away. We weren't building a country. We were building his personal bank vault, mile by bloody mile." He looked up at her, his gaze direct and filled with a self-loathing that startled her. "I designed this line. Every curve, every grade through these canyons. I know every tie, every spike from here to redemption. I walked this land before the rails ever came. I charted it. I condemned it." The confession landed like a physical blow. Ahyoka's face, which had softened with a fragile, emerging trust, hardened into a mask of stone. The man who sketched her as a child, the man with gentle hands who tended her wounds, was the very architect of her people's doom. It was his mind, his pencil, that had drawn the line that had ripped through their hunting grounds, that had brought men like Jed Stone to their doorstep. The kindness he had shown her now felt like a second, more insidious violation. "You," she breathed, the word laced with renewed venom. "It was you who drew the serpent's path." She scrambled backward, away from him, the linen on her wrists a mocking reminder of his touch. "You are the reason they came." "Yes," he said, his voice raw. He didn't try to deny it or soften the blow. He let the accusation stand, let it fill the space between them. "I was a fool, blinded by ambition, and a dream that wasn't real. I thought progress was worth any price. I didn't understand that the price was a people's soul, your people's soul, and my own." He stood and walked to the edge of the firelight, turning his back to her, looking out into the impenetrable darkness of the desert. "I quit. I told Blackwood what he was doing. He laughed at me. He said men like me were a dime a dozen, but men like him owned the future. So, I walked away. I thought if I disappeared, if I lived a different life, I could outrun the ghost of what I'd done." He let out a humorless laugh. "But you can't outrun the tracks you've already laid." A lone coyote howled in the distance, a mournful, lonely sound that underscored their isolation. The cry was answered by another, closer this time. Ahyoka's head snapped up, her warrior instincts taking over. The night was no longer empty. "They will hunt us," she said, the statement flat and certain. "Jed Stone, he will not return to Blackwood empty-handed." Ethan turned back to her, his face grim. "I know we can't stay here." He looked her over, her bare feet, her weakened state. "We need help, a place to lie low. I know a man. An old prospector named Silas. He lives in the canyons to the north, in a trading post that's little more than a hole in the rock. He hates the railroad more than any man I know. He'll help us." Ahyoka looked from Ethan's earnest, haunted face out into the darkness that held unknown dangers. To trust him felt like a betrayal of her people, of everything she stood for. But to face Jed Stone's men alone, in her condition, was a death sentence. She was caught between two poisons, forced to choose the one that offered a sliver of a chance. She gave a single, sharp nod. It was not forgiveness. It was not trust. It was an alliance born of pure necessity, a temporary truce in a war he had helped to start. We ride at first light, Ethan said, understanding the unspoken terms of their new arrangement. He took the first watch, settling near the edge of the camp with his rifle across his lap, his eyes scanning the moon-drenched landscape, a lonely sentinel guarding the woman who was both his penance and his only hope. Part 3. The journey north was a silent education. They moved through the canyons like ghosts, Ethan's knowledge of the terrain and Ioka's innate connection to it forming a strange, effective partnership. She taught him to read the subtle language of the land, the meaning of a displaced stone, the warning in a hawk's circling pattern. She showed him which plants held water and which could be chewed to numb the ache in his tired muscles. In return, in the quiet of their brief, fireless camps, he would scratch diagrams in the dirt with a stick, explaining the mechanics of the iron serpent she so despised. He showed her the relationship between fire, water, and steam, how pressure in a confined space could be harnessed to move a piston, to turn a wheel, to drag 1,000 tons of steel across a continent. He spoke of it not with pride, but with the detached intimacy of a creator dissecting his own monster. She listened, her expression unreadable, absorbing the knowledge, understanding the soul of the beast she sought to slay. Silas's trading post was less a building and more a wound in the side of a red rock cliff. Tucked away at the end of a box canyon, it was a ramshackle collection of sun-bleached timbers and adobe mud, almost invisible until you were nearly upon it. A single, arthritic mule tethered outside flicked its tail at the flies, and a scruffy one-eyed dog lifted its head and let out a half-hearted bark. The door creaked open before they reached it, revealing a man who looked as ancient and weathered as the rock around him. Silas was a knot of sinew and silver hair, his face a roadmap of hard-lived years, his eyes a pale, suspicious blue. He held a massive, long-barreled Sharps rifle, like it was an extension of his own arm. "Miller," he grunted, his voice like gravel grinding together. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Figured the buzzards had picked your bones clean years ago. Who's this?" His gaze fell on Ioka, and the suspicion in his eyes hardened into outright hostility. "She's with me. Silas," Ethan said, dismounting. "We need a place to lie low. We've got trouble." "You always got trouble," Silas grumbled, though he lowered the rifle. He eyed Ioka again. "Comanche trouble, by the looks of it. That's the worst kind. Sticks to a man." "The trouble is with Blackwood's Railroad," Ioka said, her voice clear and strong, meeting the old man's hostile gaze without flinching. This gave Silas pause. He squinted, his expression shifting from distrust to a grudging interest. "Blackwood," he muttered, "the name a curse. That snake oil son of a bitch. Any trouble of his is welcome at my door." He stepped back, gesturing them inside with the barrel of his rifle. "Get in. But if she touches anything, I'm billing you for it." The inside of the post was a cluttered, dimly lit cave, smelling of dust, leather, and cheap whiskey, furs, tools, and provisions were stacked to the ceiling. Silas poured 3 glasses of something that looked like murky water and tasted like fire. "Jedstone's men are hunting us," Ethan explained, getting straight to the point. "They left her for dead on the tracks." Silas whistled low. "That's Stone's brand of work, all right. Man's got a heart like a dried-up gourd. What did you do to get on his bad side?" "She exists," Ethan said simply. "Her people are in Blackwood's way." The old prospector grunted his understanding. He refilled his glass, his eyes glinting. "Well, you picked a fine time to stir up that hornet's nest. Couple of Blackwood's surveyors were in here yesterday, trading for whiskey. Tongues got loose. Seems the Baron is shipping a big one." "A big what?" Ethan asked. "Payroll," Silas said, a greedy smile cracking his leathery face. A whole train car full of it, 2 days from now. Enough cash to pay his men for the next 6 months and buy up half the territory. It's the money he's using to push the line through your people's land, he added, nodding at Ahyoka. Ethan and Ahyoka exchanged a look. The air crackled with a new, dangerous possibility. It was a lifeline, a weapon, a target. But their silent planning was cut short by the frantic barking of the one-eyed dog outside. Silas moved to the door, peering through a small crack. "Damnation! Miller! I said you bring trouble." He pulled back, his face grim. "It's Stone. Got at least 5 men with him, spread out at the mouth of the canyon." Instantly, the quiet sanctuary became a trap. Ethan grabbed his rifle, moving to a dusty window at the side of the post. Ahyoka, armed with the knife Ethan had used to cut her free, found a position near the back wall, her eyes scanning for any alternate escape. "No way out but the way you came in," Silas growled, barring the thick wooden door. The first shot shattered the tense silence, splintering the doorframe inches from Silas's head. Another ripped through a window, sending a cascade of stored tin cans clattering to the floor. "Miller!" Jed Stone's voice boomed from outside, cruel and confident. "I know you're in there. Send out the squaw, and we'll let the old man live." Ethan didn't answer. He waited, his breathing steady, his eyes fixed on a rocky outcrop where he'd seen a flash of movement. He saw it again. A man raising a rifle. Ethan squeezed the trigger. The roar of his Winchester filled the small space, and a cry of pain echoed back from the canyon. "Wrong answer," Jed bellowed, followed by a volley of gunfire that peppered the front of the post. They were pinned down. For the next hour, they exchanged fire, a desperate, unwinnable stalemate. The attackers were patient, content to pick them off if they showed themselves. During a lull, as one of Stone's thugs tried to use a fallen boulder for cover, he got a clear line of sight through the shattered window, right at Ethan. The man's eyes went wide, not with aggression, but with pure, unadulterated shock. "Miller?" he yelled, his voice cracking with disbelief. "Ethan Miller? You're supposed to be dead. Blackwood said you died at Silver Creek." The words, shouted in the heat of battle, seemed to hang in the air, louder than any gunshot. Outside, Jed Stone let out a harsh, rasping laugh. Inside, the world stopped. Ahyoka froze, turning her head slowly to stare at Ethan. Her face was a mask of cold, dawning horror. "Silver Creek," she whispered, the name of the infamous bridge disaster falling from her lips like a shard of ice. Her people had spoken of it, the great white man's folly, a bridge of steel and greed that had collapsed into the gorge, taking dozens of workers with it. It was a cautionary tale, a symbol of the white man's careless destruction. Ethan's face went pale beneath the grime and dust. He had been so focused on the fight, on survival, that he hadn't considered this. He hadn't considered his past had a name that would mean something to her. He didn't just quit. He didn't just walk away. He had faked his own death. He was a coward who had run, leaving ghosts and a legacy of ruin behind him. Every fragile thread of trust they had woven on the journey north, every shared moment of understanding, evaporated in that single, damning sentence. She looked at him now, not as a complicated ally, but as a liar, a ghost who had no right to redemption. The siege outside suddenly seemed trivial compared to the one that had just begun within the dusty walls of the trading post. The silence inside the post was a thick, suffocating blanket, punctuated only by the distant taunts of Jed's men. Silas, oblivious to the drama unfolding, was busy reloading, muttering curses under his breath. But Ahyoka saw nothing but Ethan. She rose to her feet, her movements stiff with rage, and stalked towards him. "You ran," she hissed, her voice low and trembling with fury. "You built a bridge that killed men. And then you ran and hid like a coyote." "It's not that simple," Ethan started, his own voice strained. "It is never simple with you, is it?" she shot back, her dark eyes blazing. "First, you are the man who drew the path of the serpent. Then, you are the man who saved me from it. Now, you are a ghost, a liar who left his own people to die." She jabbed a finger toward the door. "How can I trust you to fight them when your whole life has been running from men like them?" "Because I'm done running," he exploded, his voice echoing in the cramped space. The sudden force of it made her flinch. Blackwood cut corners on the Silver Creek Bridge. He used inferior steel. He pushed the crews too hard. I warned him. I told him it wouldn't hold, that it was a death trap. I wrote reports. I begged him to listen. His voice cracked with the memory, the old guilt still raw. He buried the reports and threatened my life if I ever spoke of it. The day it collapsed. I wasn't there. I was in redemption, trying to get the territorial inspector to listen. By the time I got back, it was too late. They were all gone. He sank onto a nearby crate, his rifle resting across his knees, the fight momentarily forgotten. Blackwood's men were waiting for me, not to help, but to silence me. They told the world I died with my men. A tragic hero. It was the perfect story for him. The brilliant engineer who died in his own flawed creation. No one would ever question the company. So, yes, I ran. I let them think I was dead. It was that, or be buried in an unmarked grave with the truth. Which would you have chosen? His confession, raw and steeped in pain, did not erase the lie, but it painted it in a different, more desperate light. Ahyoka stared at him, her own anger warring with a flicker of understanding. He was not a simple coward. He was a man trapped by a monster of his own making. "We're not getting out of this sitting here jawing about the past," Silas rasped, peering through a crack in the wall. "They're settling in for a long wait. We're low on water, and I'm damn near out of shells for this sharps." Desperation clawed at them. They were trapped, outnumbered, and outgunned. It was then that Ahyoka's expression shifted. The fury in her eyes was replaced by a sharp, calculating glint. She was a warrior, and her mind was now working on the tactics of survival. "There is another way," she said, looking directly at Ethan. "Not to run, to fight, but not your way." She turned to the old prospector. "Is there a way out of this canyon? A back way, known only to the rock and the snake?" Silas stroked his grizzled beard. "There's an old goat trail, barely a ledge, climbs right up the back of the cliff. Ain't been used in 20 years. Leads into the high country, Comanche territory." He eyed her meaningfully. "My uncle kills the enemy. His warband camps in the high country," she said, her plan forming as she spoke. "He has refused all treaties. He fights the railroad. He fights men like stone." Ethan looked at her, understanding dawning. "You want to lead them to us? To him?" It was an audacious, incredibly risky idea. "No," she said, a fierce light in her eye. "I want to lead us to him. We cannot win this fight with 3 guns and a crumbling wall, but with 50 warriors, we can do more than just survive. We can take the fight to them. We can take that payroll train." The sheer boldness of the idea was staggering. Silas let out a low whistle. "That's not a plan, girlie. That's a suicide wish. It is the only path that does not end with our bones bleaching in this canyon," she retorted. "But my uncle will not trust a white man, especially not a ghost." She looked at Ethan, a challenge in her eyes. "You will have to prove you are no longer running. You will have to prove your spirit is as strong as your anger." The decision was made. Under the cover of darkness, they made their move. Silas created a diversion, setting off a small charge of blasting powder he used for prospecting at the far end of the canyon. The explosion and the subsequent rock slide drew the attention of Jed's men. In the confusion, the three of them slipped out a back window and began the treacherous climb up the goat trail. The ascent was harrowing, a vertical scramble in the moonlight. When they finally reached the top, gasping for air, they found themselves in a different world. The tight, claustrophobic canyons gave way to a wide, wind-swept mesa under a canopy of 1,000,000 stars. After giving them directions to the hidden camp, Silas bid them farewell. "This is as far as I go," he grumbled. "Too old for war parties, but you give Blackwood hell. Miller, give him hell for the both of us." Aye, they traveled for a day. Ahioka leading the way with an unerring sense of direction. They finally found the camp, nestled in a hidden valley. It was not a village, but a warrior's outpost, bristling with an air of defiance. The warriors who met them were hard-faced and suspicious, their eyes lingering on Ethan with undisguised contempt. They were brought before Kills the Enemy, a tall, imposing man with a face like carved granite and eyes that held the cold fire of endless war. Ahioka spoke to him in their native tongue, her words flowing fast and passionate. She told him of her capture, of the payroll train, and of the man who stood beside her. Kills the Enemy listened, his expression unreadable. When she was finished, he walked a slow circle around Ethan, studying him like a strange, captive animal. "You built the iron road that scars our land," he said in surprisingly clear English. "Your hands are not clean. Why should I believe you are not a snake, shedding your old skin only to bite us again?" "Because I have seen the face of the man who holds the leash," Ethan replied, meeting his gaze. "And my teeth are now bared for him, not for you." Kills the Enemy was not convinced by words. A man's heart is shown not by his tongue, but by his courage. "Tomorrow, you will ride. There is a passage through the canyons we call the Needle's Eye. It is a place where the spirits test a man's soul. You will race one of my best warriors. If you win, we will listen to your plan. If you lose—" He left the threat hanging in the air, a chilling finality in his tone. "Your ghost can haunt Blackwood on its own." The morning air was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of sage and the chill of the high desert. The Needle's Eye was a terrifying gash in the earth, a canyon so narrow that in places the sheer rock walls were barely 20 feet apart, twisting and turning like a serpent's spine. The race was not one of simple speed, but of nerve and madness. The path was a crumbling ledge, littered with loose rock, with a drop of 1,000 feet to the canyon floor below. Ethan's opponent was a young, arrogant warrior named Raven, who rode a lean, black stallion that seemed carved from shadow and fury. Ethan was on Dusty, his own reliable but unremarkable Mustang. The Comanche warriors lined the canyon rim, their faces impassive, waiting for the white man to meet his end. Kills the Enemy dropped his hand. Raven let out a piercing war cry and shot forward, his stallion eating up the treacherous path with reckless speed. Ethan held back. He wasn't a Comanche warrior. He couldn't win this race on their terms, on pure, unadulterated bravery. Ahioka's words from the night before echoed in his mind. Prove your spirit is as strong as your anger. But he had another strength. His mind. The mind of an engineer. As Raven navigated the turns with instinct and grace, Ethan watched, calculated. He saw the path not as a trail, but as a series of stress points and angles. He saw where the rock was most likely to crumble, where a horse's momentum would carry it too wide on a turn. He wasn't racing the warrior, he was racing the physics of the canyon itself. He cut a corner tighter than seemed possible, using a small rock slide to his advantage, letting Dusty slide and find his footing rather than fighting the unstable ground. He urged his horse on, not with frantic speed, but with a calm, focused intensity, conserving the Mustang's energy for the final, most dangerous stretch. As Raven, confident in his lead, took a wide, sweeping turn, Ethan saw his chance. He drove Dusty straight through a narrow, crumbling gap between two rock spires, a shortcut no sane rider would attempt. For a heart-stopping moment, horse and rider disappeared in a cloud of dust. Ahyoka held her breath. Then they burst out onto the path, miraculously ahead of Raven. He won the race by less than a horse's length, not through bravado, but through calculated, intelligent risk. He returned to the camp not as a conquering hero, but as a man who had earned a measure of respect. Kills the enemy looked at him with new eyes. "You do not ride like a warrior," the chief said. "You ride like a man who understands the breaking point of stone. Perhaps you do understand the breaking point of men like Blackwood." That night, they planned the assault. Ethan, using charcoal on a stretched deer hide, drew the train from memory. The engine, the tender, the baggage car, the armored payroll car, and the caboose. He knew its weaknesses, its blind spots. Ahyoka and her warriors planned the attack itself, a synchronized assault from horseback, a feat of daring that seemed impossible. The raid was set for 2 nights later, under the cover of a forecasted thunderstorm that would mask their approach. As the sky turned a bruised purple and the first rumbles of thunder echoed in the distance, they rode. They were a band of ghosts, moving through the rolling hills, a fusion of ancient tactics and modern knowledge. They caught the train in a long, open plain, a black serpent slithering through the stormy darkness. The engine's headlight cut a lonely path through the driving rain. On Ahyoka's signal, the war cry went up, a sound that blended with the storm's fury. The warriors descended on the train like a force of nature. Their speed was breathtaking. They rode alongside the thundering cars, their horses keeping pace with the monstrous machine. One by one, with a grace and courage that defied belief, the warriors leapt from their saddles, landing silently on the slick, rain-lashed roofs of the train cars. They moved like panthers, silent and deadly. Below, Ethan and a small group of riders galloped towards the front of the train. His job was to uncouple the passenger cars, isolating their target. He swung himself from Dusty's back onto the iron ladder of the tender, the wind and rain tearing at him. He climbed over the coal and dropped into the cab, startling the engineer and the fireman, who he quickly subdued with the butt of his pistol. He pulled the brake, but not to stop the train, just to slow it enough for his real work to begin. Meanwhile, on the roof, Ahyoka and her warriors faced Jed Stone and his guards, who had been waiting for them. The fight was a brutal, chaotic ballet of death on a speeding stage. Knives flashed in the intermittent lightning. Guns barked, their sound swallowed by the thunder. Ahyoka moved through the chaos with lethal precision, her fight not just for the money, but for the memory of her home, for the indignity she had suffered on these very tracks. She came face to face with Jed Stone on the roof of the armored car. He was a bear of a man, with a cruel smile and a massive revolver. "I should have left you for the vultures. Squaw!" he roared over the storm. Their fight was vicious. He had brute strength, but she had speed and a burning rage. As they battled, pinned down by the guards suppressing fire, the train suddenly lurched, a violent, screeching jolt that threw everyone off balance. Miles down the track, a massive rock slide, precisely engineered by Silas from a map Ethan had drawn for him, had blocked the rails. The engineer Ethan had tied up, in a last act of defiance, had managed to release the main brake just before losing consciousness. The train was now careening towards the rock slide, out of control. The chaos was the opening they needed. In the confusion, Ethan, having made his way back along the train, managed to work the coupling pin loose between the passenger cars and the payroll car. The front half of the train, now free, began to slow, while the rear cars, with most of the guards, continued hurtling towards the blockade. Jed, realizing what was happening, turned from Ahyoka and fired wildly at Ethan, who was now perched precariously between the cars. The bullet missed Ethan, but struck the side of the payroll car with a loud clang. As Jed took aim again, Ahyoka lunged, driving her knife into his shoulder, not deep enough to kill, but enough to make him scream and drop his gun. With a final desperate shove, she sent him tumbling from the roof, his scream swallowed by the roar of the storm and the screech of twisting steel as the rear cars plowed into the rock slide behind them. They had the payroll. They didn't flee into the wilderness as Blackwood would have expected. Instead, Ethan put his final, most audacious plan into motion. He and kills the enemy's warriors forced the terrified engineer to get the severed front of the train moving again, but not down the main line. Following Ethan's instructions, they switched the tracks at a forgotten junction, redirecting the engine and the precious payroll car toward the one place on Earth Blackwood would feel safest, the half-built, dust-choked railroad town of Redemption. It was Blackwood's operational hub, the heart of his growing empire. To attack him, there was to march directly into the serpent's mouth. They rolled into Redemption at dawn, the train engine hissing and groaning as it came to a stop in the center of the unfinished main street. The town was a chaotic collection of saloons, tents, and wooden storefronts, populated by the disgruntled, underpaid, and overworked laborers who were building Blackwood's dream. They were a volatile powder keg, and Ethan was about to light the fuse. He climbed atop the armored car, a rifle in one hand and a stick of dynamite from Silas's stash in the other. Ahyoka and the Comanche warriors took up strategic positions on the rooftops. Silent, deadly sentinels overlooking the scene, the townspeople, drawn by the commotion, began to gather, their faces a mixture of confusion and suspicion. "My name is Ethan Miller," he yelled, his voice carrying in the still morning air. A murmur went through the crowd. Some of the older workers recognized the name, a ghost from the Silver Creek disaster. "I was the chief engineer for this line, and I am here today to deliver your payroll." He lit the dynamite and used it to blow the lock on the armored car door. With a theatrical heave, he threw it open, revealing the stacked, iron-bound strongboxes inside. The crowd gasped. "For months, Bartholomew Blackwood has paid you in scrip and promises," Ethan continued, his voice ringing with conviction. "He has worked you to the bone, building his empire on your broken backs, while he gets rich. He told you I died at Silver Creek, but he lied. He lied because I knew the truth. He used cheap materials that killed 27 of your friends. He is a thief and a murderer." Just then, Blackwood himself arrived, flanked by the corrupt town sheriff and a dozen of his most loyal thugs. He had been alerted by a telegraph from the wreckage of the first train and had ridden all night, his face a mask of incandescent rage. "Miller, you're a dead man!" Blackwood shrieked, his fine suit rumpled and stained with dust. "Sheriff, arrest this man. Arrest them all. They are thieves and savages." The sheriff and his men drew their guns, but the crowd of laborers, their eyes fixed on the money and their hearts ignited by Ethan's words, hesitated. They looked from Blackwood's furious face to the open payroll car, and a dawning realization passed through them. "This money is yours," Ethan declared, kicking one of the strongboxes, which tumbled to the street and burst open, spilling stacks of cash into the dust. "Wages you have earned. All you have to do is take it." That was the spark. Greed, resentment, and a desperate desire for justice exploded in the street. The workers surged forward, not as a mob, but as a rebellion. The sheriff's men, seeing the tide turn against them, either fled or were quickly overwhelmed. The main street of Redemption erupted into a full-scale battle. In the midst of the chaos, the final confrontations became brutally personal. Jed Stone, having survived the fall from the train with a broken arm and a face contorted by hate, staggered out of the sheriff's office. He ignored the riot, his eyes fixed only on Ethan. He charged, tackling Ethan from the roof of the car. Their fight was not one of graceful gunplay, but a visceral, bone-jarring brawl in the dirt and mud of the street. Jed was stronger, but Ethan was smarter. He used his engineer's knowledge of leverage, tripping Jed over a discarded rail tie, using the man's own momentum against him, and finally ending the fight by trapping his head against a train wheel and knocking him unconscious with a heavy wrench. It was a brutal, ugly victory, won not with a bullet, but with a tool of the trade he had once loved. Meanwhile, Ahyoka had her own target. She moved through the battle like a wraith, ignoring the flying fists and bullets, her focus entirely on Bartholomew Blackwood. He had taken refuge in the land office, trying to barricade the door. Ahyoka didn't try to break it down. She climbed onto the roof, pried a board loose, and dropped down inside, silent as a falling shadow. Blackwood spun around, pulling a small Zetter ornate derringer from his coat. "Get back, you filthy savage," he spat, his voice trembling. Ahyoka smiled, a cold, dangerous smile. "You call me a savage," she said, her English precise and chilling. "But you are the one who destroys everything you touch. You are the one who leaves nothing but scars on the land and ghosts in the river." He fired, the small gun making a loud pop in the enclosed space. But she was already moving, using a desk for cover, a whirlwind of calculated motion. He was a man of ledgers and contracts, completely out of his element. She didn't attack him directly. She dismantled him. She threw a heavy inkwell that shattered against the wall next to his head, spattering him with black ink. She upended his meticulously organized maps and plans, the paper arteries of his empire. She systematically destroyed his world before his very eyes. Terrified and humiliated, he stumbled backward, tripping over an overturned chair and falling into a helpless, undignified heap. She stood over him, her knife in her hand, not as a killer, but as a victor. She had not just beaten the man, she had shattered the myth of his power. The dust settled over Redemption. The sound of gunfire was replaced by the murmurs of the liberated railroad workers, who, under Ethan's guidance, began to organize, securing the town and the remaining payroll. Bartholomew Blackwood and his cronies were locked in the town's small jail, stripped of their power and prestige, awaiting the arrival of a federal marshal who would be far less inclined to take their bribes. The Iron Serpent's head had been severed. An uneasy peace fell upon the land. The immediate threat was gone, but the scars, on the landscape and on the people, remained. A few days later, in a quiet valley away from the town, Ahyoka brought Ethan before Kills the Enemy and the elders of her tribe. The warriors, who had once looked at him with contempt, now regarded him with a deep, hard-won respect. "You have fought with the heart of a Comanche," Kills the Enemy said, his voice resonating with authority. "You have bled with us. Our victory is your victory. We offer you a place among us, a home, a people." Guys, it was the greatest honor they could bestow, an offering of belonging to a man who had none. Ethan looked at Ahyoka, her face calm and proud, and a profound sense of gratitude washed over him. He saw the life he could have here, a life of purpose, of connection to the land and its people. But he knew, with a certainty that was both sad and freeing, that it was not his path to take. He bowed his head respectfully. "You honor me more than I deserve," he said, his voice clear and steady. "But I cannot accept. My fight with Blackwood is over, but the world is full of men like him. My path is to stand against them, not to hide from them. I am a builder who has learned what it means to destroy. Perhaps now, I can learn to build something that lasts." Kills the Enemy nodded slowly, a deep understanding in his ancient eyes. A man must follow his own trail. We will not forget what you have done. Ethan Miller. Later that day, as the first light of dawn painted the eastern sky in hues of rose and gold, 2 horses stood silhouetted on a ridge overlooking the vast, open plains. Ethan, mounted on Dusty, adjusted his saddlebags. Ahyoka rode up beside him on a powerful roan mare, not in the buckskin of a warrior, but in practical riding clothes, a rifle resting in a scabbard by her side. She had made her own choice. Her duty to her people was to ensure their future, and she now believed that future lay not just in defending the past, but in forging a new path forward. There was a comfortable silence between them, the silence of 2 people who had been through fire and emerged on the other side. Changed. The distrust was gone, replaced by a bond forged in shared danger and mutual respect. "Don't know where this trail leads," Ethan said quietly, his gaze fixed on the endless horizon. The future was a vast, unwritten page, both exhilarating and terrifying. Ahyoka looked at him, not with the fiery anger he had first seen, nor the wounded betrayal he had earned, but with a calm, confident strength that seemed to draw power from the rising sun itself. A small, knowing smile played on her lips. "We will make our own," she replied. There were no grand declarations, no promises of forever. There didn't need to be. Their shared past was a testament to the world's divisions, but their shared gaze, fixed on the horizon, was a promise of a future built together. He reached over, and she took his hand, her grip firm and sure. Together, they turned their horses, and side by side, equals on a new frontier. They rode not into a setting sun,